Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Fissa with Adam Schrader. Today we have Serena Valentino on our show. You may have heard of her. I have heard of her. I haven't read her books, I'll admit that, but she is a huge New York Times best-selling author of the comic book series Gloom Cookie and Nightmares and Fairy Tales, as well as author of the villain novels published by Disney Press. Her latest new book is Cold-Hearted Villains. And we brought her on the show because she's Serena Valentino. That's number one. And number two, she does a lot of work. Disney Press publishes the villain novels, including her latest book, Cold-Hearted. Get that on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or the Disney Store. She is an expert on Disney characters. We're going to be talking about that. I live in Florida, about less than an hour and a half from Disney World. So without further ado, Serena Valentino, it is a true pleasure to have you on our show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you guys.
I want to start the discussion by talking about Disney. So what you've done in your villain series and some of your other fairy tales is you essentially extrapolated Disney characters to create your own horror fairy tales. I think that's pretty creative. So let's start with what inspired you to do this. Were you just a little girl, 6 years old, 7 years old, reading Disney books, watching Disney movies, and you said, I want to create my own stories based on these characters that the movies or that the books didn't cover?
Exactly. You got it exactly right. Yeah. I'd be watching, the original Disney classic film. We'll take Sleeping Beauty, for example. And, Maleficent storms into the christening. She crashes the party, right? Because she's mad that she didn't get invited to the christening. And I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be more to this than that. She can't she can't just be mad because she didn't get invited to a party. And then you can see how the three good fairies seem to really dislike her. And there's some kind of weird antagonistic situation going on between them. What happened with the three good fairies and Maleficent? And Maleficent is a fairy too, right? So what makes Maleficent a bad fairy and makes the three good fairies good fairies? And I thought about that a lot. I thought about why would, Grimhild, the evil queen from Snow White, want to kill her daughter just because the mirror says that she's prettier than her. That doesn't make any sense. Somebody's got to be really vain in order to go that route, right? So you nailed it right on the head. It's from me watching the movies growing up and thinking, what's the real story? What's the story behind, that led these characters to lead them to the place that we know them in the original classic films.
So starting writing the stories like this, how did you even get, or I don't even know, as an author, do you need permission from Disney to write this? Because it seems like it would be something you'd have to go to them and be like, hey, I want to use your character and write a story and sell it. How did you go about doing that?
Well, the cool thing is it was like Disney magic. They approached me. So I had been writing a couple different series of comic books at the time, and I was writing my own versions of retellings of fairy tales called Nightmares and Fairy Tales. And those were they were like horror comics, they're pretty bloody. They really, were more in line with the Grimm's version of fairy tales, but I kind of would, take it to another level. And one of the editors at Disney at the time, he saw the work that I was doing, and he approached me and asked if there were any characters from Disney that I'd be interested in writing about. And I was like, oh my God, please, let me write a story about the villains. And yeah, and it just all went from there.
The way you were talking about your nightmares and fairy tales, talking about the Grimm, did you work at all or talk to the people who made the show Grimm for all those years? Did you talk to them at all?
No, that show came out like way after I did Nightmares and Fairy Tales. This was like back in like the 90s that I was doing these books. And like
I didn't know if they had read any of your stuff and been like, hey, she'd be a good person to consult on that.
Well, that would have been lovely. That would have been a great job to have. But no, that didn't happen. Yeah, I mean, I ended up working for Disney. So, that it worked out great.
Well, I want to go back and talk about that journey, because you talked about, you touched on, as a child, you had this interest, but there's a lot that happened in between. You went to middle school, you went to high school. I'm assuming you went to college. You maybe did something after college. So fill in those gaps a little bit, because I'm curious to hear more about your story. I'm sure you just didn't just start writing one day and then you did the Grimm stuff, you did the fairy tales, and then Disney just came and said, here's a big contract. I'm sure there was a lot that happened in between.
Right. Well, I mean, even though I was intrigued by these characters, and I was like concocting their stories in my mind, growing up, I'm dyslexic. So growing up, I didn't have a lot of,
wow.
So I didn't think that I would be able to be a good writer, even though I truly wanted to be one. I didn't think I would, I didn't think I was smart enough, quite frankly, because I felt daunted by the fact that I had dyslexia when I was younger. So I pursued a lot of other interests. I pursued like musical theater. I went to college to teach drama. I performed in, stage plays and things like that. And I enjoyed it. But I think like in the back of my mind, I always really wanted to, tell stories. And I thought, well, maybe I'll write, some stage plays. And I sort of dabbled in that a little bit. But I think that my fears of not being a good enough writer were always looming. And at one point, I got inspired to write a story and decided to push past those fears. And I shared it with a friend who lived in the neighborhood, who happens to be a comic book illustrator, Ted Nafee. And he's like, this would be a really cool comic strip, like, why don't we sit down and, figure out how you'd like me, to illustrate it. And so he illustrated it. And it was just like a short little story. It's the first story that appeared in Gloom Cookie. And he was like, let's like photocopy it, make our own book, do like a self-published thing and take it to San Diego Comic-Con and see if anybody's interested in it. And I was like, okay. So we jump on a plane, we go to San Diego Comic-Con, we pass out like our little homemade comic. At the time, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac and Lenore were kind of big, like in indie comics at the time. And I was a fan of Lenore, and I gave a copy of my Lex and Max Gloom Cookie story to Roman Dirge, just because I was like, hey, I want to share my art with you. And, I didn't think anything of it. And then the next day, as I'm walking by that booth, he runs over to me and he's like, hey, Serena, I showed this to my publisher and he wants to talk to you. And I was like, okay. So I talked to the publisher and he basically invited us to pitch. He invited us to, officially, pitch the Gloom Cookie comic book idea. Now, quite frankly, I hadn't thought about what Gloom Cookie would be about besides that first story that I wrote. So we get on the plane and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to write a proposal for consideration. And I brainstormed the entire comic series like on the plane ride home, and got home, wrote it up, got together with the illustrator. We, did everything that we needed to do for the pitch. We pitched it. And we got really lucky, and he said that he was gonna publish us. So that's my story and how I broke into writing comics. I know that isn't everybody's experience, and quite frankly, I always feel bad in a way, even though like I'm so happy it worked out that way for me. I don't want like other creators to feel discouraged if that's not their experience, because it hardly ever happens that way. But
yeah, that's a good neighbor to have.
Right. Exactly. And we also happened to hit the industry at a time when there was a publisher that was looking for that particular type of work. You know, the 90s was sort of an interesting time for comics, and it was especially an interesting time for goth comics, which is what Gloom Cookie was, right? And so it was timing, it was everything. And I felt like I was given this like gift, you know. I was like, oh, I can write. I can write. I can tell the stories that I always wanted to tell. And I had a really great experience, you know, doing Gloom Cookie. The series lasted for quite some time. There's so many issues. I mean, I can't even tell you off the top of my head how many issues there are. There's like a ton. And then I was doing like Nightmares and Fairy Tales and having a great time with that. And then like magic, like a fairy godmother, a Disney editor appears, you know, and says, would you like to write for us? And I'm just like, hell yes, I do. You know, and so that's pretty much how it happened.
It looks like, you know, based on Gloom Cookie and Nightmares and Villains, you're into the shadier, like darker side of society. What led you to like that that writing?
Well, you know, growing up, my dad is like a big horror fan. And so growing up, I watched like all these old horror movies with my dad, you know, so I'm like really into like Vincent Price and Boris Karloff and, you know, the Twilight Zone and the old, you know, Hammer films. I mean, like all of it, you know, I just grew up loving it. My dad would let me stay up late, you know, to watch Creature Features, which was like a Bay Area, like, you know, horror, you know, they would show like a different horror movie like every week. And I grew up like loving that stuff, and I continue to love it as an adult. You know, it seems natural to me, you know, that my dad laughs, you know, I'm always thanking him, like, thank you, Dad. Thank you for sharing your love of horror with me, because it's absolutely like fun to write.
Do you write, you know, we're the work from home show. Do you write from home, or did you like rent? Do you have a place where you go to write, or what's your way of writing?
I write from home. I have before the pandemic. I always found it interesting, you know, before everybody started working from home, I never felt like people truly understood what it was like, you know, to be a person that has to work from home. You know, it's like if you're in a roommate situation, you know, your roommate might think that if you're the one that's working from home, then certainly you can deal with the plumber that's coming over, or like the UPS packages, or any number of things that happen while you're working from home. They didn't get it that you're actually working, you know? So, but yeah, I work from home. Sometimes, you know, before the pandemic, I would go to a cafe and put on my earphones and, you know, sit with my laptop and work, you know, from a cafe, just to kind of be around other people, you know, and then like take a break, maybe chat with somebody that I know from the neighborhood or whatever. But for the most part, I'm at home plugging away.
And when we spoke before the interview, home is Napa Valley, California.
Yeah, I'm in Napa. I'm in Old Town Napa in California. Yeah, I'm a Bay Area girl. I grew up in the Bay Area. I lived in San Francisco for 20 years and decided on a whim to move to New Orleans. So I lived in New Orleans for about 3 years, and just recently, within the last year, moved back home to California.
Why New Orleans?
I just always wanted to live there. I had it. I mean, like, I think probably when I was around like 15 or 16, my mom was like, hey, there's this cool book by Anne Rice that I think you'll like. I just finished reading it. Why don't you read it? And I just, you know, I probably sound like a big dork, like saying that, but I fell in love in New Orleans, like the moment that I, you know, started reading Anne Rice's books, and the love for it just grew. And I had a great experience living there. I loved living there. I thought that I was going to live there for the rest of my life. But I fell in love with somebody who lives here in the Bay Area, so I moved back home.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, that's kind of what happened to me. So I just always wanted to live in Tampa, which is where I live now. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you ever visited New Orleans before you moved there, or if you just read the book and you're like, I don't need to visit. I know this is the place. I never visited Tampa. I didn't know anyone. I never visited. I just, based on what I saw, based on what I read, it was like, okay, this is, in the United States, this is my paradise.
Right. That's awesome. I had visited New Orleans very frequently. I went like at least once a year, and I have like really close friends and people who live there. So I had a lot of like New Orleans experiences before I moved there. So, but yeah, I love it there. It's a beautiful city, and the people there are incredible. And it is literally like no other place like in the world. And I miss it, but I mean, but California is my home. The Bay Area is my home, and I love being here. And I'm glad I'm back. But I always consider New Orleans like a second home.
One thing that I want to bring up, so you brought up your father with the horror movies, your mother with Anne Rice. What impact did your parents have in shaping your interests and your career overall?
Well, my dad was always very encouraging when it came to reading. I grew up in like the 70s and 80s, and there was always like these really cool book clubs. And my dad wasn't really big on buying us lots of stuff, but he was always big on buying us books. If the dude came by to sell encyclopedias, he's like, yes, we'll buy the encyclopedias. And he had me like signed up to all the different book clubs, so I was like reading all the time. And so I think that in conjunction with his love of horror, like really instilled like a love of reading and a love of like storytelling. And my dad, he has like the best sense of humor. He's like one of the funniest guys like in the world. So I think that, I'm hopefully that rubbed off on me a little bit. And my mom is a voracious reader. I mean, she reads everything, and she reads quickly. She's like a speed reader. So I've got like a mom and a dad who are both like always like encouraging me to read. My mom's always calling me, "Did you read this book?" And I'm recommending books to her. And so, yeah, I mean, they both have always been very very supportive, over the years about, the choices that I'm making like for my career. And, it wasn't an easy road, like deciding to do an artistic thing for your career. It's arduous, because you don't know if you're going to get work. You're always sort of, trying to hustle, to get the next job. And, there'd be times where I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to afford to pay the rent? And, luckily, my mom was always there, to tell me like, it's okay. Like you're going to make it, you're going to get to a place where, you're going to be able to depend upon this, as your career. And she was right. And here I am.
So you're telling me, so I'm curious about this. Being a writer is one thing, but starting with a comic book, how did they take that? Because, I know if I told my parents that, they would be like, how are you going to make money in comic books? It's not really, you can't make any money doing that. How did they take that? And then also, can you talk a little bit about the process of collaborating with, because obviously you were writing it, but it had to be illustrated as well. And that relationship you had to have with the artist whenever you were making the book.
Right. Well, I was an adult and moved out of the house by the time I decided to do comics. I think I was 28, 29, somewhere around there.
That might even be worse for the parents, being like, oh, she's never going to make money.
But I also had a day job, right? I didn't think I was going to make a living writing comics. I had a day job. And I continued to have day jobs even when I started writing for Disney. Right. Because I didn't know if I was going to keep writing these books. I wasn't sure if there was going to be an audience that, that wanted to keep buying them. And therefore, there'd have to be a reason, to want, for Disney to want to keep publishing them. So I had a day job up until I think like the third or fourth book. So
what was that day job?
I was mostly a nanny, actually.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I was in the game industry for a long time before I started writing, like in distribution and retail and, development and stuff like that. And then but when I was really seriously thinking about, being a writer, I thought that I needed something that had a little bit more flexibility, and being a nanny was perfect for my needs. It paid really well. And I love hanging out with kids. So, it was the perfect, like, side gig,
Yeah.
to
Plus
make.
an excuse to watch fairy tales, right?
Yeah, exactly. I can run my story ideas past them and see if they were good.
That's a
So,
great idea. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And, it's really cool because I'm still in touch with, some of the families, whose children I cared for. I'm still in touch with some of the kids who are now, much older. And, it's awesome. And they read my books. It's really cool. And then I also had some like crazy jobs too. I think at first when I started doing Gloom Cookie, like I worked in like a metaphysical shop, I mean, I've done like all different kinds of like little side jobs to keep myself going while I was, trying to get my writing career off the ground.
So can you talk a little bit about the working with the artists on the comic books and that process?
Yeah, it's a really amazing process actually, to collaborate with an artist. Like one of my favorite parts of comic book collaboration is the character design process. So I get to describe the character. I'll give them like visual references, how I want them to look and everything else. But when you get that illustration back from the artist and they've somehow managed to capture exactly what you were thinking, but also put their sort of spin on it. It's a beautiful thing. Like it's probably one of my favorite things about creating comic books. It's like every day you're getting like a different character, and then you start to get the storyboards in, and it's wonderful. I really love that process. I've been telling people that I think that writing for comic books is actually more challenging than writing a novel, because you have to adequately describe what's on the page, how many panels are on the page, what's happening in each panel, what's going on with all the characters. You're writing the dialogue, but you're also describing the scene. But you want to be able to give the artist some freedom as well, so that it is a collaborative process. But you're also taking in mind like what's happening with the lettering, what's going to be going on with like the shadows, the atmosphere, the coloring, everything. So, it's almost like more in depth, and you have like so much less space on the page to tell the story than you do with a novel. I mean, I think both mediums are awesome to write in. I feel that writing for comics is a bit more challenging than writing the novels, because of the novels I can have somebody talking or thinking or remembering something for like 30 pages if I wanted. That wouldn't skew as well in a comic book, or having like somebody have a conversation at the kitchen table. In a novel, it would just be talking heads, for what, 32 pages. Like in a comic, that wouldn't be very exciting for the artist to draw, and it wouldn't be exciting for the reader to look at. So I love it. I love the collaborative process with artists, sitting down and figuring all that out.
With your villains series, do you have just a long list of villains you want to write about in the future, or kind of how are you taking it book by book?
I have it all planned out. So there's a connective thread that connects all of the novels together. So I really have to plan everything out ahead of time, because not only am I like tackling each villain's story, but I'm also I have like a side storyline that's going on at the same time. So currently I have like the next 4 books planned in my mind, and I know exactly each villain that's going to be, in each story, and what's going to go down. It's like this huge map in my brain, that I've already have plotted out.
Can you tell us a little bit about the newest book that came out? Kind of what villain are you covering, and just tell us a little bit about it.
Cold Hearted, is the 8th book in the villain series. And it features Lady Tremaine, the wicked stepmother from the movie Cinderella. It also focuses on her daughters. I think people like to call them the evil stepsisters, Anastasia and Drusilla. It's really like, it's a heartbreaking story, really, because Lady Tremaine is living in London and having a wonderful life with her, 2 stepdaughters who are admittedly, overindulged and possibly rather spoiled. And Lady Tremaine's thinking like, oh my gosh, if I don't stop like indulging these girls, like they're going to be spoiled like beyond like redemption. I need to do something about this. She's like widowed for I think about 6 years at this point in the story, and she starts to think to herself, I think it's time to maybe find a new companion. She's starting to feel lonely. She wants, someone to spend her time with. And she meets this man named Sir Richard, who's Cinderella's father. And they fall in love almost instantly. And back in those days, like lords and ladies, they can meet somebody and like marry them almost like immediately, because back then you get married and then you get to know the person, right? Like you're not allowed to spend any time alone with somebody that's courting you. So she meets this man. It's like a whirlwind experience. She gets whisked off to the many kingdoms, to like a place like full of magic. And she thinks this is like her, happily ever after. She thinks that she's like the heroine of her really awesome story. And she gets to the many kingdoms and she realizes that she's the villain, that she has already been pigeonholed by virtue of being a stepmother, by virtue of like, of being in the story. It's already been written. It's like predestined that this wonderful woman is going to be transformed into a wicked stepmother and perpetuate the same abuse that she had received from Cinderella's father.
Serena Valentino, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home show. You're the New York Times bestselling author of the bestselling author of the comic book series Gloom Cookie and Nightmares and Fairy Tales. Your latest book is Cold Hearted, which is a part of the Villain novels published by Disney Press. The website is serenavalentino.com. Serena, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners or anything else you'd like to promote?
Well, I've got a graphic novel adaptation of Evil Thing, my novel about Cruella de Vil that came out last year. We've adapted it to a graphic novel, and that's coming out on September 26th. I'm really excited for readers to see it.
Great. Well, serenavalentino.com. Serena Valentino, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home show. To all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. Like us on social media. We are everywhere. Leave us a review on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, whatever podcasting platform you use to listen to us. If you have any questions, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. We'd love to hear from you. And until next week, keep on working from home.